The coronavirus has spread a lot of fear and anxiety among populations around the world. We've seen some of its effects on our political, legal, and economic systems, and it remains to be seen which of these will be in the short term and which of these will be with us for the longer term. It just seems to me to be the perfect justification for any would-be autocrat to implement policies to consolidate and centralize their power. Yet the Kremlin appears to be pursuing policies of decentralization, placing emphasis on regional leaders and regional authorities. Is this just a pragmatic decision, or is there something more significant at play here?
Frankly, this is already a hyper-presidential system. So in some ways, it's not that Putin was needing that much more power. Secondly, though, we also have to consider that these are systems that are made up of human beings. And a lot of, I think, what we're seeing in Russia really reflects Putin the person, rather than Putinism, the political system. We've seen this before. He is actually very risk-averse. He's willing to be daring and decisive, but only when at least he thinks he has game planned out the outcome. In this situation, I mean, by definition, this pandemic is impossible to predict, particularly for a country like Russia, which has such huge disparities in public health provision and so forth. And in these circumstances, he seems to be something, well, I'd say almost on the point of paralyzed politically. So he's actually sort of stepped away. I mean, he first of all put responsibility on the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, to basically be his coronavirus czar, shall we say. He was trying to downplay it. He didn't want to use the word quarantine. He called it a paid holiday for people and so forth. On one hand, pushing responsibility onto the governors with the perfectly reasonable suggestion that individual regions will have their own characteristics. But what he's not doing is sending resources and powers to match. In effect, he's actually setting them up for a fall. And we'll have to see how this plays out, because I think increasingly governors are actually getting quite bolshy and saying, well, hang on, if we're meant to deal with this, where's the money? Can we order local military hospitals opened and that kind of thing? Is afraid of the potential consequences, doesn't want to be blamed for whatever happens. And his natural instinct in these circumstances is essentially to abstract himself away from the decision-making process.
Yanin had suggested that it was worse than had been estimated, or that Kadyrov had argued back with the Prime Minister. How significant are those kind of, as you say, those talking back to some degree to the central government?
I think this is going to be one of the really interesting and potentially disruptive factors of the virus in Russia. It's precisely you have a system which is theoretically federal, in practice imperial. But now precisely because governors, who are after all elected, albeit with all kinds of degrees of Kremlin pressure, but nonetheless they are elected, they have now been given the job. Putin is publicly upbraiding them, saying that they're acting sluggishly and that if they don't really do the job, they might be criminally negligent and so forth. Now, in some cases, you actually have governors who do have some resources at their disposal, and therefore they'll use them. We'll see in Tatarstan, for example, which has oil. They are using them, and we've got quite a sort of a strong lockdown there. This forces them to make a very tough choice. Do you basically just be a good soldier for the Kremlin? Do your best, don't do a very good job, and accept all the blame for that, even though you knew that you were hamstrung from the first? Or do you actually start grumbling and complaining and telling your local constituents that it's all Moscow's fault, which is the temptation? Actually acts as quite a disruptive force. We'll have to see. And it may well be that, in fact, Putin will come to realize that, in fact, the biggest threat is precisely from the perceived inaction, and we will suddenly see him once again come the Tsar. But at the moment, as I said, he's still in his paralyzed phase.
The coronavirus has forced the Russian authorities to cancel the constitutional referendum due to be held on the 22nd of April. How much does their subsequent handling of the crisis pose any meaningful threat to the eventual holding of the constitutional referendum, or even the potential passing of the constitutional amendments, even when the referendum is held?
Putin was distinctly unlucky. He was under no legal requirement to hold a national vote. He did it precisely because he wanted that sense of legitimation, that kind of theatre of affirmation that said, well, the whole country is behind this. He held on against probably one of the reasons for his rather slow response to coronavirus. It's clearly that sort of desperation, hoping that he could still hold an election. He could decide to actually just say, well, we don't need that. However, look, I mean, coronavirus, unless it becomes much, much more problematic than we fear, is not going to prevent the holding of a vote at some point in the next 12 months. So odds are, given that really this is all part of the setting up for 2024 with the end of his current presidential term, he will probably still hold it. Now, on the other hand, how badly or how well the centre is deemed to have responded to the virus will absolutely play in very heavily. And although he hadn't wanted it to be that, it probably will end up being essentially a referendum on Putin. That said, he's not going to lose. I mean, this is the thing about elections in Putin's Russia. The question is not, will the Kremlin get the result it wants? It will. It's, what is the cost of doing that? How much administrative resource, how much propaganda, how much out-and-out ballot box stuffing will it have to go through to get that result? And what will the wider legitimacy cost be? So again, we'll have to wait and see. My own hunch is that it won't play well for him, and that they will actually, whereas before they were in a situation where they probably were going to win without too much jiggery pokery, because they worked in all kinds of elements which were quite crowd pleasing, like raising minimum wage. And so post-COVID, it probably is going to be that much harder. And therefore, they are going to have to resort to the kind of electoral manipulation that people are aware of and frankly annoys people and undermines the regime.